the topic of your webinar is very interesting. I found it very interesting because you talk about forms of telling. We have been talking about narration, narrativizing, and actually narrating for the past 4 decades now. And there's been so much theorizing on narration and narrating that somewhere I felt that we have lost the idea that narrating actually entails somebody telling something and others listening to that something. Yes, especially when we are talking of myth and we are talking of oral tellings, oral narratives. So we talk of myths, we talk of literature, and literature being both oral, written, performed, etc., or even painted or etched and whatever. It is very important that this connection between the teller and the hearer in whatever media to be established, to be made, and to be understood. So, though I know that this is aimed more at students, so I have chosen to go very simple, just kind of illustrate how every telling or every retelling is also a remaking or re-narrativizing a particular text. So let's go back to the beginning. Storytelling has been a strong point of Indian culture. I have always maintained that Indians are great storytellers. And even if you ask them the direction to some place, they will inevitably end up using a simile or a metaphor or tell you some anecdote to go with the story. In the hills, especially when tourists come by the hordes from the plains and they get very tired walking in Shimla, whenever a tourist will ask a local person, how far is, let's say, the Kali temple, Kalibari? All the locals will just always say, just 2 or 3 curves ahead, just 2 or 3, just 2 bends ahead. And that's a story, because it is not really 2 bends. It's quite a way off. But that is our local way of one. We do not realize how difficult it is sometimes for tourists to walk on our slopes. Second, for us, the Kali temple is just here. It's just a stone's throw away. It is part of our emotional landscape. You were talking about landscapes in the morning, and very fascinating talk by Mihir and also by Aruni. That landscape is so emotionally tied up with us that we don't really measure it in distance. Whereas when you have a tired tourist wearing uncomfortable shoes and desperate to reach the temple, that 2 turns might translate into a long distance. So storytelling is not only part of literature. Storytelling is a way of life, and it's a very important way of life for Indians. All Indians, I think, even though I'm making a broad sweep generalization, but I would like to stick my neck out on this one. However, in recent times, storytelling has been replaced by the electronic entertainment. And we are seeing increasingly even parents, for example, or grandparents who used to tell stories in the households, turning on the television or turning on the internet on their mobile phones and handing it to children to entertain themselves while the parents either feed them or go about their work, so that they know that the children are engaged. That is a poor substitute, according to me, because what is missing in the electronic entertainment, though we have lovely stories, lovely animations, beautiful cartoons, and what have you for students, what is missing is the connection between the teller and the listener. And for me, that is a very important element when we tell stories. So, although it's good to have them there and it's good to turn to them, but they cannot really be a substitute for the human connection. That's my point. So, stories are also now being told on social sites, and multiple variants of the story spring up ever so often. I like to compare these stories to Rakta Beej, in which the stories proliferate in no time. And there is no question of a truth anymore, of course. But how many narratives can be sustained on a grain of a story? The original story, by the way, will be lost. It's like the Rakta Beej. We don't know which is the original one. There are hundreds of variants which have come up. And the original story, mind you, not the truth, but the original story lies somewhere between a bot and a grand server. And nobody really can shoot down that original. So we have to make do with even the original becoming part of the many variants that we see on social sites. And I have deliberately compared it and used the simile of Rakta Beej because they can be very destructive. They can be extremely confusing and bewildering, and somewhere the moral center of our society is challenged every time these bots and trolls come into play. As we know, myths and stories and lore are dynamic. They evolve with every telling. You know, if my dadi told me a story, and then my dadaji told me the same story, the story would undergo a change. And how would it undergo a change? Because the personality of the teller and the emotional connect of the listener with the teller would come into play. And and so as we tell these stories over and over again, the same stories, Kachue ki, Khargosh ki, over and over again, they evolve with every telling. And only the canon is somewhat static. None of the other stories are static. And I'm saying somewhat static, and that too for periods of time, because canons are being challenged all the time. Only I think the religious, we should keep out of this discussion. Religious stories are becoming more and more difficult to deal with because tolerance or not of subversion and blasphemy are coming into play more than ever. And thankfully, dogma does not concern us directly in literature, except as stories. So that is a cushion that we can use. Now, telling a story is important to keeping it alive. A story will die if it is not told. Paradoxically, documenting it in writing has also become crucial because stories are dying with the tellers. As the tellers pass on, the stories are going with them. This is the way we lost a lot of traditional knowledge, a lot of folk medicine, a lot of folk wisdom, because the tellers stopped telling and the listeners stopped listening. And all that body of knowledge has disappeared. I hope some of it can be reclaimed, but definitely we need to document our stories. But paradoxically, again, as we document them, we also fossilize them, because when we put it in writing or in an audio or a visual form, then we have fixed it. And over a period of time, it will fossilize. So we fossilize one version of the story, making it imperative for us to note the time, the place, when, where, person, who told the story. And this is usually missing in the older documentations of folk tales and songs. Okay, even though folk songs and tales का origin नहीं पता है हमें, पर कब उसको हमने written में डाला है, वो हमें लिखना जरूरी है to contextualize that version of the folk tale, and that version may just have been the version of one person. That's something that we need to pay attention to. And then what happens? Some details are, of course, found in the audio and the visual documentations, but the point to remember is that this is one of the several versions that has been written here, and there must have been, and there probably are, many other versions which are extant, versions as well as variants of it, which are extant. I like to use a simile for this process of documentation, and I always hold that when we document a story, uh, it's like scooping out a handful of water from a running, flowing river. And we need to know that and not claim that this is the version of the folk tale. There is no the version. So every oral retelling is crafted differently by the teller. It may be a mere pause. It may be a stress or an inflection, even the intonation. It could perhaps be a reshuffling of the events or even a reinterpretation of the events. It may be filling of the gaps. So the same story will appear different coming from different people. I'm very fond of asking my young friends, some of whom are in my class, to relate and narrate stories of any movie or any series that they have watched. Most of the children come up now with OTT series and stories of them. So when they tell those stories, especially in a group, all of them have watched the same series. Each one of them narrates it so differently. And they argue with each other. No, no, this is not what it means. No, he said this, she said that. No, and they argue so, enthusiastically and emphatically. Then I ask them, are you all telling me the same story? Or is this different series that you have watched? And each one is very convinced that their narrative is the narrative. And that's one way of telling the students that there is no the narrative. And unfortunately, I haven't watched most of those series, so my interventions are rather superficial, but it does illustrate the fact to the students that the story lies in the manner of narration also. It does. So some days ago, we had marked the bicentenary of John Keats's birth anniversary, bicentenary. I want to bring in two concepts which Keats has given us for poetry, but I would like to bring them in for the craft of telling stories or narrating stories. The first one, we are also familiar with, negative capability. And as Keats said, let us be happy, being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason, because we are creative, we are literary, and we are not journalistic. So fact, तो अब तो journalist को भी fact नहीं मिलता. That's another story for another session. But to rest in doubt. What a beautiful idea. To rest in doubt, because जब हमें doubt होता है, we get restless. Oh, find out the truth, or tell us what happened, what exactly happened. We all become inquisitors, and we all become police officers. Tell us the truth, what happened, what exactly happened. What a beautiful thing, to rest in doubt. To continue in your efforts to understand more and more of a text, while being comfortable with the idea that you might never understand a text completely. What a beautiful idea. That there is always some insight which is still out of reach for us. And so we retell the story and we retell the story. And there is always something new that we dig out of that story. Well, how beautiful can that be? And the second one, which is more important for me, the capability of submission. What a young boy, 25 years dead and gone, his name written in water. But what a beautiful concept of to be capable of submission, to be humble as you approach a text, to be willing to challenge your own assumptions, to critique your own perspectives, to doubt yourself, to doubt your understanding, to doubt the theories to which you have subscribed for so long. Take a text and doubt yourself. That, I think, is the ultimate quality which a student of literature should have. So, when we start questioning ourselves, we open the door to new insights. That's what Keats said. So it is like the nightingale's song. Every telling will hear a new song. Every retelling will be a new song, while the kernel, the sweetness or whatever, remains the same. But the notes of the song will alter. And they will alter, not only for the teller, but also for the listener. It is dynamic in terms of the connection of these two categories of people also. So before I go any further, and I hope I'm not boring you, you please let me know if I'm boring you, and I'll quickly change track. Binoy?
You're fine, ma'am. Absolutely interesting. Please go ahead.
Okay, you're kind. So, but I will continue. So allow me to tell you a folk tale from Himachal, which has several cousins, I'm sure, in other parts of the country, even other countries. It's called Four Conditions for Marriage, and it's been taken from the book that Dr. Vibhuti just referred to. This particular story was documented by Dr. Moluram Thakur in his anthology of Himachali Folktales. Now, Dr. Moluram Thakur is very renowned and an extraordinary scholar from Himachal and has connections with DU as well. So let me just very quickly tell you the story. It's a folk tale in which a king has 4 sons and he asks his sons to marry. The 3 older sons agree to getting married, but the youngest prince chooses to remain single. So once the brothers are married and the sisters-in-law come into the family, they begin to taunt the young prince and say that you think too much of yourself and you think you're too good to marry someone like us. And who do you think you're going to marry? Perhaps you want to marry Chandrakumari, the princess, famed for her beauty and her intelligence and what have you, and who has many suitors, but none of the suitors have been able to fulfill the 4 conditions for marrying her that the king has instituted. And all the princes who had tried so far have been put in prison, and they've been working the millstones, and they will do so for the rest of their life. So here is a challenge that the sisters-in-law throw to the young prince, and he finally gets fed up of their taunts and decides, okay, I think I will go and marry this Chandrakumari. So he sets himself on his horse, and the horse and the... After days of travel, they reach a riverbank where the prince hears the cry of help, help. And when he looks at the river, there is a colony of ants which is being swept away by the flow of the river. And the prince very quickly climbs up on a tree, pulls down the leaves of the tree, which are rather big, and he floats them down the river stream. And the ants scamper on the leaves, and they reach the bank. Once they are safe on the bank, the chief of the ant comes to the prince and says, "Thank you for helping us. We'll never forget your kindness. And remember us whenever you are in trouble, and we will come to your aid. If ever you have a problem you cannot solve, remember us and we will come to your aid." So the prince continues on his journey. After many days, he comes upon a cat chasing a mouse. The mouse calls out for help. The prince asks the cat, requests her, don't kill the mouse. The cat says, I haven't eaten for days. If I don't eat the mouse, I will die of hunger. So the prince says, you come with me. I'll give you milk. So the mouse thanks him, and the cat thanks him after having the milk. And she says, whenever you face an unsurmountable problem, remember me. He travels further. And as he's crossing a forest, he finds a wildfire and a few lion cubs caught in that fire, in that blaze. They call out for help, and the prince stops, jumps into the fire, and saves the cubs. The cubs then tell him, we will help you whenever you are in distress. Just call for us and we'll be there. So finally, he reaches the kingdom of Chandrakumari's father. The first thing he does when he reaches there is he lets his horse out to pasture. And then he continues to the garden of the king's palace, where he sees Chandrakumari with her friends. She's so awe-inspiring that he swoons. And by the time he comes to, the princess has already left. Next morning, he goes to the palace and tells the king that he would like to vie for the prince's hand. The king tells him there are 4 difficult conditions. Nobody has succeeded so far. And you now do what? It's better that you go back. Don't try. It's very difficult. But the prince insists that he is up to the challenges. So the first condition is spelled out. The king tells him that his men will scatter grains of wheat all over the town. And by the next morning, the prince has to gather all the grains and bring them in a heap, in a mound to him. You know what happened. The ants were remembered. The ants came running. The ants collected the grains, and the first condition was met. The king was very surprised. He hadn't expected this. Anyway, he said, okay, but the second one is even more difficult. Why don't you depart? The prince says, no, I'm going to give it a try. So the king says, okay, here are 2 rings. 1 ring will stay with the princess. 1 will be given to you. By tomorrow morning, these 2 rings should be exchanged. Now, the mouse comes to the rescue. He takes the prince's rings, goes and comes back with the princess's ring. So the prince asks him, what did you do? How did you manage? The mouse said, the princess had hidden the ring in her mouth as she slept. So I stuck my tail up her nose. She sneezed. The ring fell out. I picked it up and I brought it. The second condition was met. The third condition was then spelled out. There was this cow in the king's palace who would not allow anyone but one particular milkmaid to milk her. Now, the prince was asked to milk this cow the next morning. The cat came to the rescue. She stole the milkmaid's dupatta and brought it to the prince. The prince wore that dupatta, and while it was still dark, he went to milk the cow. The cow recognized the dupatta, the smell of the dupatta, and she allowed the prince to milk her. The fourth and final condition had now to be met. The king told the prince that you must sleep in the lion's cage, my pet lion's cage. He's hungry, and you have to spend the night there. The lion was the cub's father. So the cubs went running to the father and told him the whole story of how the prince had saved them. And when the prince was brought to the cage, the lion did not attack him. When everybody else had gone away, the lion told him, you've been so good to my children. Rest in sleep well. Don't worry. I won't harm you. And the next morning, all the 4 conditions had been met. The prince was married to Chandrakumari. And then the story ends with the sisters-in-law being even more envious of the prince as he returns with Chandrakumari. Okay, so that is the story in brief. Let us now look at this story and let us try to make sense of some of the things that are embedded there. The first thing to which I'd like to draw your attention is the fact that the feats to fulfill the 4 conditions for marriage are not performed by the prince at all. They are executed by his small animal friends. All the feats are done by the ants, the cat, the mouse, and the cubs. The prince has not, and I underline not, shown any valor, courage, or any resourcefulness in completing these 4 conditions for the marriage. So where was the feat? Where was the valor? Where was the heroism that was required to finish or achieve these 4 conditions? Those were performed before he even reached the palace. When were they performed? They were performed during the journey. And what were the feats? What were they? The feats were saving these 4 different animals. The feats were compassion, kindness, goodness, and good sense. The feats were not bravery. It was bravery when he went into the wildfire to save the cubs. But it was not bravery as in spending the night with the lion. It's a very interesting story. Because usually when there were conditions for marriage, remember Sri Ram and Sita's Swayamvar, even Draupadi's or anybody else's, Amba, anybody's Swayamvar, there is something valorous that you have to do, something great and heroic that you have to do in order to meet that condition. But here, the prince doesn't do any of the 4 feats. The feats are compassion, which he has already done, which is a quality that he has shown. It is an ingrained quality. He does not turn a deaf ear to the cries of help. He responds to them. And so, it's a story in the traditional mode, but it's a story which really unfolds for us a different kind of valor, a different kind of a value system. All right. This whole story of the prince with all these animals and the insects places him together with the animals and insects in an interdependent ecological frame. The animals are not less than human and the humans are not greater than the animals. They are interdependent for survival on each other. So even that little sentence about the prince first taking the horse to pasture before coming to the palace for his own work, for his own, should I say destiny? I'm not so sure. Maybe you can tell me about it. Was there a role of chance or destiny that the prince should come upon these 4 creatures who were in distress, and that he should respond to them in the manner that he responded to them, and then he would be rewarded for it. He would be helped in turn for it. This interdependence is something I would like you to mull over and think about. Let's turn now to the frame of the story. The jealous sisters-in-law. It is a common trope in many stories, as we know, especially in folk stories, and it is also a stereotype. The jealous sisters-in-law. Let's pause here and think, why are they jealous? Why? Because the prince chose not to marry, did the sisters-in-law feel slighted? Why did they feel that girls like them were not good enough for the prince, and that's why he did not marry? Why did they not think that it is just a choice that the prince exercised for his own self, with no censure or critique of the sisters-in-law or the kinds of women that they were? This is something, again, that is in the hands of the teller to negotiate, even though it's not spelled out in the folktale. But here is something that the teller can can expound upon and take care of. And as literature students, let's think about what narrative role does their jealousy play? Isn't that the spike? Isn't that the motivator for the plot to continue? And in all these places, there is room for interpretation. And the teller's worldview will affect that interpretation. And so my telling will be different from another person's telling, even though our worldview may be same. A pause or a glossing over might make that difference. So there are absences and gaps in the tale. For example, where are the queen mothers? Usually when weddings take place, mothers have a central role. But in this folk tale, in both the households, the queens are missing. The brothers of the prince are absent. Where are they? What were they doing? What was their opinion about their wives' taunts for the prince? How did the forest fire happen? Why did it happen? What set off the fire? In Himachal, we are very afraid of forest fires. We've had very scanty snow this year, and we are already seeing forest fires in patches. And it strikes terror in us people. We are very afraid of our forests being burnt down. We cry and we weep when we see forest fires. No amount of tree plantation is going to replace the biodiversity of the natural forests. It's a matter of great concern. Will a storyteller take this gap in the folktale and bring about a sensitivity towards forest fires? Will we do it? Who will do it? How will they do it? Those are interesting things that we need to look at as the story is being narrated. So, stories also lie in the crevices of these absences and gaps, and these are to be excavated by the teller. And the listener's role is crucial in this, because if you have a curious listener, if you have a listener who is invested in the story, then they will ask questions. They will pose questions on these absences, on these gaps, on these silences. Maybe the teller herself can be the questioner. Perhaps a little child to whom you're telling the story. Perhaps a class full of literature students. Here is an opportunity for the narrative to open. Now, let's look at Chandrakumari's trials. I hope I'm not going on and on. Maybe I'll sum up in 5 minutes. Okay, Chandrakumari's participation in the trials as part of her Swayamvar. Let's look at it. Is she happy about it? Or is she not? Does the fact that she participates in the 4 conditions for marriage, remember the ring in her mouth, does that indicate agreement? Or does that indicate being forced? Or does that indicate being happy about it? Remember that when the prince saw her in the garden, she was happy. She was beautiful, radiant. So what does that indicate for us? About her Swayamvar and the conditions that have been attached to them. From a feminist point of view, let us look at Chandrakumari and ask ourselves the question, is she the trophy? Is she the object of the valor of the prince? Or, in the Indian tradition, is she the Virya Shulka? Virya Shulk comes from the Agni Puran. It is also mentioned in Valmiki's Ramayana when Sitaji's Swayamvar takes place. What is this Virya Shulk? It is the price of valor that is shown by the suitor to show that he is worthy of this girl. Price or prize, the trophy. We have to question this. We have to look at it very carefully and look at the narrative of the text. Look for the clues that are there and then come to a conclusion. We'll have to question our own biases when we are looking at this Chandrakumari's happiness and participation in the Swayamvar. Remember when Janak decides that Sita's suitor will have to string the bow of Shiv's Pinak. Why did he decide that? Not arbitrarily. It is because he saw Sita lifting the bow, or some say the table on which the bow was placed. And because he saw that, he said, okay, I must marry her to somebody who is as valorous. Sita is here shown as a powerful girl, and somebody who she marries should be able to match her valor. And that's what Janak decides. Did Sita agree with Janak on this or not? That's a question we need to answer. So nobody else in the land was able to even lift, even shift the bow, Pinak, but Sita could lift it. And ultimately we realize, or we see that Sri Ram is able to not only string it, but break it. So it is interesting also further to note, when we look at Chandrakumari's agency in the issue of her agency, very interesting, that she is the only character in the whole story who has a name. The prince does not have a name. The king does not have a name. Nobody else has a name. It is only Chandrakumari who has a name. I'm going to stop there, and I'll open myself to discussions, because I hope I have been able to make you a little curious, if not more.
First, I would like to congratulate our dear friend and colleague, Dr. Meenakshi, for a wonderful presentation. And I have a query. In fact, you brought in reference to Raktbij, and you said it's difficult to come across truths, difficult to find out the truth. But I'm a bit curious about this fact. If we are talking about fiction, why should we be so concerned about finding the truth? Because we are saying that multiple telling and retelling of stories is possible, multiple interpretations are possible. And similarly, in the later part of the lecture, you talked about negative capability, Keats's negative capability. That's possible to remain in doubt and uncertainty without hankering after truth. So why did you bring in the reference to Raktbij? And why did you think that's so important to have one particular kind of truth? Because in fiction, it's almost it's a given in fiction that one single truth is not possible.
Thank you, Parveen sir. Thank you. Yeah, that's exactly why I took Raktbij, to emphasize that there is no truth that we are looking for anymore. Of course, there was a disapproval of the way, especially on social sites, the way an event just spins out of all proportions. That is why I chose Raktbij. But of course, I already said there is no question of a truth, and there is no striving even after a truth. But sometimes things, especially trolling, spiral so much out of control that it is very bewildering in an unrestful way. When Keats says negative capability, the beauty of it is that you are able to rest in your doubt. But when you spew venom and hatred, and there is so much of it, then it is difficult to rest in your doubt. Actually, that's the analogy I was striving to reach at. I hope that answers your question.
It's not a question exactly what I want to ask. It's just an observation. I always believed that Swayamvar was a kind of, feminist power. Women getting a power to choose their husbands. But you brought another angle to it by saying that who decides the condition for the Swayamvar. For that matter, in the context of Sita, you mentioned that a condition was laid that if somebody would lift that dhanush, but the condition was laid down by Was it by Sita? I'm not aware. Or was it by Dashrath?
By Janak.
Sorry?
By Janak, Sita's
Sorry,
father.
yeah, by Janak. The condition was laid by Janak. So again, the whole Swayamvar thing becomes patriarchal when the condition is being laid by the father.
Thank you, Sangeeta. That's great. Yes, the concept of Swayamvar has been looked at very carefully from various angles, and sociologists have done a great study on it. Some people are convinced that it is part of the patriarchal tradition. Some people feel that no, there was some leeway for a woman to make a choice. But you see, there were always conditions for the Swayamvar. Who could come, who could not participate in the Swayamvar. That was pre-decided. Not everybody could come to participate in the Swayamvar. We know the story of Prithviraj Chauhan and Sangyogita. Yes, so there was always pick and choose. Naturally, that is something that we see around us even today when we look at arranged marriages. Parents have a huge role to play, and even in deciding the kind of person or family into which they will want to send their daughter. How much leeway does a girl have in all this? That is the issue. So
Yes,
was
Bhavita.
Sita happy with the condition that Janak had imposed for her Swayamvar? The idea in Indian terms is this, that you don't just invite everybody and anybody to become a suitor. So there are certain parameters that you set, and within those parameters, maybe the girl has a choice.
She
But
has a say.
that
She has
is
a
when
say in
she
that.
go, that idea that we have, that she has a Varmala and she goes looking at all the princesses who have presented themselves there. But there is also the idea of valor attached to this. So it's not just that a prince has come there. If you remember in Sita's Swayamvar, Ravan was also there and he failed. And it was only Sri Ram who was able to pick up the bow. So when you look at that, then there is no question of an emotional connect. Even though sometimes you see the garden is always shown as a place outside the palace where the prince might see the princess or the princess might see the prince, and some initial attraction might take place. That is what happens between Sitaji and Sri Ram. That is what happens to our prince. But in this case, Chandrakumari does not see him. He sees her and he faints. That's another issue that can be looked at. Why does he swoon? He looks at her and he swoons. So overcome by her beauty or whatever. What is this idea of beauty? There is a stereotype. The princess has to be beautiful and the prince has to be brave and courageous. So though there are stereotypes here too, but within those stereotypes, what I'm suggesting is that you can put in so much of your contemporary, your own lived experience, and interpret the tale differently from even the frame that it has been placed in. So, and sometimes you may not even want to reinterpret it. You may just want to challenge it and question it outright. And you have every right as a teller to do that. Yeah. So Swayamvar, do the girls have agency? That is debatable. There could be some agency, little agency, or if the girl is participating fully in those four conditions, then perhaps her agency is taken into consideration, or maybe she is just fallen in line with her father's agency. So those are questions which will take us to the idea of negative capability. Do I make sense?
Yes, you do, ma'am. That's very fascinating take on how narratives, how myths and folklore are kind of is understood, and some of the perceptions that exist in this kind of mythic realm. And yet there is this sort of very fascinating readings that that your talk kind of uncovered. I don't have questions, but more of a kind of some of the things that I was struck by. One is you began talking about retelling as remaking, and thereby talking about the act of transcreation, something that we talk when we talk about translation, right? So how when one is engaging with is engaging with folklore and myths, one is constantly in the process of transcreation. And you in fact answered one of the questions that I wanted to ask you, is when we begin documenting the folklore or the oral and myths which are part of oralist culture, storytelling culture, it is in the nature, that the nature of it is in the nature to shift and constantly evolve. But what writing does is that it freezes them, and so I was thinking of how to resolve that contradiction. But you gave a very beautiful image of of a flowing river, and which will prevent the fossilization of, and will allow for multiple meanings, and perhaps that answers why it is that we, despite knowing the endings or how a story moves in our epics, for instance, right? Despite that, we are enchanted by our epic stories, and we want to watch them no matter how many versions appear on TV, or there are so many retellings. In fact, in the last couple of years, there have been so many people who have been writing the character, from the character's point of view. So you have retellings of the existing traditional stories in a new, from different characters' point of view. So much so that it almost gives a newer, not only a new perspective, but it also has the capacity to completely transform the original idea, as it were, of Ramayana or Mahabharata, even while retaining the core of those stories. The other point that was also very interesting was the interdependence of human and the animals, which somehow, to me, until you mentioned it, somehow seemed that animals were mostly used in the more in mythical, religious, mythical sense. Animals more used, and birds mostly used as vehicles, literally so, very often as tools for as agents for human beings, for what they want to do or intend or achieve. But you talk about the interdependence, where they are not simply that. So you actually bring back the focus to an ecosystem where each is dependent on the other in a mutual relationship. And so that was a very interesting idea that I take from your lecture. And towards the conclusion, you talked about different retellings, versions, narratives of any given story. You talked about different perspectives, and which I think is really where we as literature departments is something that is our core, right? Something that I think the word that we use is methodology. The word that we use is literary approaches in order to arrive at these readings. So I think you have really done a wonderful job at bringing together all of this, and in that sense simplifying the academic. Very often we lapse into theoretical jargon, and perhaps for us students we are not. I'm afraid because we resort to those language inevitably, so we perhaps don't make sense. But your unpacking of these ideas, and how we approach them through myths and storytelling was quite interesting. So thank you so much, ma'am.